Well, a number of politicians who claim they've been targeted by China are testifying today at the foreign interference inquiry. Among them, former Conservative leader Erin O'Toole. He says foreign interference not only cost the Conservatives up to 9 seats in the 2021 election, but it also may have cost him his job as party leader. Former Conservative leader Erin O'Toole joins me now. Mr. O'Toole, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back.
You said today that the misinformation pushed by China probably cost your party about 9 seats in the 2021 election, but it didn't cost you the government overall. How can you be so sure it was limited to that kind of an effect?
Well, I've always said that was my estimate. I used a range of up to 9 seats because of two things. We heard reports and saw evidence of misinformation in a handful of ridings in the Vancouver region and the Toronto area. And then our modeling, we did, for the first time, our party did behavioral predictive modeling that was extremely accurate everywhere in the country, with the exception of a dozen or so ridings. And you superimpose those and some of the results. I think there was enough misinformation and voter suppression to perhaps change the outcome in as many as that. It's all speculation, and it's all part of the reason I've been calling for an inquiry, a nonpartisan professional inquiry, for a few years. But it's also why I never spoke about this after the election. I respected the result too much. I lost and we moved on. But we did want to make sure that the task force and some of the mechanisms looking at misinformation and interference stepped up their game before the next election.
You made that point today. You're pretty emphatic that you didn't want to go public with concerns in any way suggesting that the integrity itself wasn't valid. Yeah, I know your traditional conservative belief in institutions, but was it all, how much of that was fueled by what we saw in the United States and January 6th and all of the big lie things we've seen in America?
Well, both were part of my consideration, David, and it was proven right that when the Globe and Mail stories did come out a year later, Jennifer O'Connell, a neighbouring MP of mine, made the direct comparison to election denialism in the United States. So we were very careful to just, after the election, we lost, we won the popular vote, and there were a number of reasons we lost, but in some seats where there was evidence of misinformation and interference, we continued to work with officials quietly behind the scenes just to make sure that the lessons were learned so that we can improve our systems. And for me, I've thought a public inquiry is the way to show the public, particularly voters in those areas, particularly voters from diaspora communities, that we are taking it seriously. We're taking their vote just as seriously as the overall result, because we do have 338 elections on election day. And the party with the most seats in the House of Commons forms government. That's how our system works.
Right, so on a macro level, you're convinced the election was fair, but there are these micro battles. Like Kenny Chu, for example, holds to this day that he lost Stevenson, Richmond East because of interference here. And I remember on this program a year ago, last year, speaking with the late Ian Shugart about this, who was part of the task force that looked into this. And his argument was that I think they would only go public and sound alarms on interference if it was broad enough and big enough to affect the big picture, and that going public on something that might be limited in scope in specific ridings could itself have a disruptive effect on the election by doing that in the middle of the campaign. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know you have some concerns about how this was handled.
Look, I have great respect for Mr. Shugart and think he was a fine public servant, but I think the collective decision made by this panel was incorrect. They had evidence of fairly widespread efforts. In fact, their own documents said there was a campaign of misinformation. The public notice, David, could have been very localized with almost a scalpel to a number of ridings saying to those Canadians, be very cautious with what you're seeing on WeChat and certain platforms.
It's tough to be that surgical in the internet age, though.
But this is what we have to do. Because I'll tell you, had I put out a notice like this, I would have been accused of fomenting anti-Asian discrimination. That was the narrative the Prime Minister had in the House when we were asking questions on the Winnipeg lab document situation, is be very careful not to inflame these tensions. So how do you take the politics out of this and make sure that our national security is respected and the democratic rights of each Canadian is respected? I'm not suggesting it's easy, David. And that's why I'm hoping the inquiry can do this, because when they're not even sharing with us documents showing that there were misinformation efforts, and a small group of 5 people make a determination that, well, it's not going to affect enough results to even warn people, that I think was imprudent.
Right, because this was something you saw today, documents from the Security and Intelligence Threat Election Task Force. This is the committee we're talking about, known as SITE, a bunch of senior civil servants, who hold significant positions in the government of Canada. And this document outlined how China was directing a disinformation campaign against your party, largely because of your positions on China. You never saw that, your campaign team never saw that. Am I correct in understanding that?
We never saw that, and in fact, the task force and the panel kind of lulled us into a state of complacency to say, yeah, everything's being taken care of. There were no issues in 2019, is what they told us at the beginning. That's obviously not been true. We've heard about the financial improprieties, and we were kind of lulled into a complacency. And I think even the well-meaning senior officials on that committee are a little naive to just how advanced some of these foreign interference measures are. And we don't have proper line of sight into platforms like WeChat, like TikTok. The Western world is struggling on how best to balance free speech, which is foundational to our democracy. But realizing some of this speech is controlled and actually manipulated by foreign state actors means I think we have to be a bit more cautious.
But how do you do that? Like, this is the great tension in a country like Canada, which has ingrained rights of expression that are protected. How do you stop WeChat, whether it's any of the Meta products, Twitter, TikTok, the Global Times, from spreading things that can have an influence without resorting to what would amount to censorship?
Well, two things. The Americans, and rarely do Democrats and Republicans agree on things, as you know, David, they agreed on making TikTok divest. I've heard a lot of people say ban TikTok. They said no, they don't want the communist regime in Beijing to be able to control an entire platform that a quarter of the US population uses and can map people based on where they live and how they use and their views. So I think there's a difference between who should own and control these platforms versus how people and people in the free world use them. And in WeChat, you can warn people and educate people that the information you're receiving here is coming from a source that can't be trusted. And I think it's a bit of caveat emptor, buyer beware, with Canadians that aren't on WeChat and don't come from the diaspora community probably don't realize that it's an app for everything.
Yeah.
And it allows people to stay in touch. So there's more voters in parts of Vancouver that get their news from that single channel than CBC, CTV, Global, all of them combined. And so we have to look at how do we at least make sure that they're not getting a message that is adverse to our values and rights.
It's tough, though, because the party you once led, they are very anti-censorship, internet regulation, support for traditional media. They see that as government buying speech. So it seems to me it would be difficult to get a consensus to take this sort of directed action at any kind of an app. Or do you think the Conservatives could come around on this?
I have never said it's going to be simple.
No, I wasn't suggesting.
The one thing I think, the way Mr. Trudeau has done sort of bailouts to media, other countries have done different things, recognize different intellectual property rights for certain media sources. The French have done that. There was the arbitration and the baseball approach that Australia had. There's a variety of ways that countries are looking at this. But I think the most important thing is if a platform is controlled and the algorithms are controlled by an adversarial country, China, Russia, we heard about today, we should be very, very careful about how important they are to our political discourse. Do we make them be divested, like TikTok, the debate they're having in the US? That's one option. Also warning and educating folks about, hey, use this to stay in touch with your family in China, use this for purchases and things like this. Do not use this as a news source. And I think the people we owe this inquiry to the most are actually Chinese Canadians who come here for the democratic freedoms that they would not have had in China. We owe it to them to make sure that they're not pressured into not voting or they're misled on something because they use a platform that is helpful for them to keep in touch with family.
You testified today that the interference didn't cost you the election, may have cost some seats, but you did suggest it may have cost you your leadership in two respects. One, had you won 5 or 6 more seats, you might have been over a threshold where it would have been more tenable for you to stay. But in your prior interviews before you were on the stand today, you suggested that Bert Chen, who's a former national director, I believe, with the party, who went public with a petition to have you removed as leader within 48 hours of the election, you suggested you had information from sources that he had relations with the People's Republic of China, and that could have motivated what he did there. What do you believe to be true about that?
Well, let me unpack that. As I said in my hours of interviews with Inquiry Counsel, there were a lot of reasons that the caucus voted me out as leader. A lot of them ranged on vaccine measures and my attempts to balance off climate and a whole range of that. And I talked about that. But one issue was this very early call for a leadership review led by Mr. Chen, but also based on the fact that I'd fallen 2 seats short from the 2019 threshold for the party. Now, it was a very different election. There was no pandemic. There was no vaccine issue. But I'll tell you, another 5 seats, David, might have given me a little bit of a toehold to sort of say, look, we've made progress. It would have been the largest opposition in Canadian history. But I'm very happy in the private sector now. I'm very proud of my time in politics. I'm participating in being very transparent because I want our system to be safeguarded for next time. So certain things in my report were told to me by people. I have no verifiable evidence with respect to Mr. Chen or anyone else. But I do think, sunshine is the great disinfectant. We need to have more transparency.
Because Mr. Chen has said he was born in Taiwan, his family fought against the communist government of China. So you were, passing that on to the inquiry for its information as opposed to laying it on the record as a claim? How would you describe your decision to share that?
I had about probably 7 hours of interviews with counsel. I was very transparent, shared documents, much like I had with Mr. Johnson, to the special rapporteur. And anything that came up that I thought was relevant, I always said, much like intelligence, David, intelligence is just an indicator. It is not evidence. And so intelligence I gain from diaspora organizations or from journalists. Much of it came after my time as leader, but I've never spoken about it publicly. I didn't even speak about the foreign interference until maybe 6 months after I stopped being leader on a podcast with Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. I'm now talking about it because this is the inquiry that has a chance to look at all these things. And I think all Canadians should want the inquiry to do well because our democracy is so important.